You're going to hear a story most families would have buried twice, once in the ground and once in their own memory. But this bloodline tried to hide its past for so long that when the truth finally clawed its way back into the light, it came in the shape of a newborn child. And the people of Harrow County still whisper that the baby wasn't born wrong, it was born honest. Honest to a history the family had begged God to forget. The tale begins in a quiet part of the Midwest, where the winding roads cut through forests older than the town itself. In those woods stands the remnants of the Aldren property, a once proud homestead now strangled by vines and silence. For generations, the Aldrens had lived with a particular rule, one spoken softly, never written down, never questioned. No unions within the bloodline, not anymore. Outsiders didn't understand it, but to the Aldrens this was sacred, a warning, a plea. Still, no one alive could remember why the rule existed. They only remembered the shame that birthed it, the sin, the punishment, and the night the family was forced to ask forgiveness from a town that wanted them gone. The incident became local folklore, something about an old act, a hidden child, and a secret so devastating it nearly tore the family tree out by its roots. But time passed, people died, and the youngest Aldren generations grew up thinking their ancestors were just superstitious, maybe even paranoid. Then came Mara Aldren. Her entire life, she had been told the same phrase, "We do not repeat the mistakes of the past." But Mara was young, rebellious, convinced the stories were nothing more than old rural fear dressed up as morality. She fell in love with someone she shouldn't have, someone with a last name that matched hers if you traced the branches far enough, and after centuries of caution, she broke the rule without ever truly understanding it. When the child was born, the nurses went pale, the doctor refused to speak, and Mara's grandmother, who had not left her room in weeks, began to pray as soon as she heard the first cry, not because the child looked unnatural, but because it looked familiar, too familiar, as though an echo of the family's oldest sin had come back, centuries later, wearing the face of the one they had never forgiven. Roots remember what humans forget, and the Aldrens were about to learn exactly what their roots had been hiding. No one outside the family could have understood the weight that Mara carried that night. In the hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed weakly, echoing in the empty hallways, but inside the room, time felt different. Every tick of the clock seemed to press against her skull like a judgment. She held the baby, and for the first time, she saw what the family had been afraid of for generations. The child's features were not just unusual. They were a mirror to a shame the Aldrens had long tried to bury beneath polite smiles and careful silence. The doctors whispered in corners, glancing over their shoulders as if the walls themselves could hear. Nurses crossed themselves. The child's eyes, large, unblinking, and impossibly dark, seemed to weigh Mara's soul. And when it opened its mouth to cry, the sound was wrong, not in tone but in rhythm, a hollow, almost guttural resonance that made the air in the room feel thicker, as if it carried the memory of some old guilt too heavy for ordinary lungs to bear. Mara's grandmother arrived before sunrise, moving through the corridors like a shadow of someone half alive. She knelt beside the bed, trembling, and whispered a confession no one else had ever been allowed to hear. She spoke of names that had been crossed off family trees, of children hidden, of whispered bargains and promises to the church that had gone unfulfilled. And she spoke of a child, born long ago, who had been deemed unforgivable, whose face had haunted every generation that followed. Mara's grandmother's tears weren't for her own sorrow. They were for the reckoning that had finally returned to claim them all. Outside, the wind rattled the old hospital shutters, carrying the scent of wet earth and forgotten graves. Mara could feel it, the sensation that the past was pressing in from every direction. Each heartbeat of her newborn felt like a drum calling her back through centuries of secrets, a pulse synchronized with mistakes made long before she had been born. And in that moment, she understood something that would terrify her for the rest of her life. Some sins don't stay buried. Some legacies cannot be rewritten. They only wait. The child, small and fragile in her arms, seemed almost to notice. Its gaze, penetrating and still, made Mara shiver. For the first time, she realized the truth she had always denied. The family's shame was not a story, not a lesson. It was a living thing, and it had chosen a face, a voice, and a body to make itself known again. Mara could not sleep that first night. The hospital room, usually a place of relief and quiet, became a chamber of whispered judgments. Every shadow on the walls seemed to shift, forming shapes she could almost, but not entirely, recognize. It was as though the house itself remembered, and it had come to witness the child's arrival. She stared at the baby, wrapped in thin hospital blankets, and tried to see only what a mother should see. But the reflection staring back at her from those wide, dark eyes was a reminder of what she had done, and what her ancestors had refused to face. She remembered the stories her mother had told her as a child. Not the fairy tale versions, but the warnings whispered in hallways when the lights were dim, when outsiders could not hear. A great-grandfather who vanished for a week, leaving behind only a diary filled with strange symbols and half-finished confessions. Cousins who were never spoken of because their existence reminded the living of shame too deep to name. And now, the past had returned in the smallest possible form, her child. Doctors continued to avoid the room. Nurses exchanged hurried glances in the hall. Mara began to notice small things that did not make sense. The baby never seemed to startle at sudden noises. The eyes followed movement in ways that no newborn should. And sometimes, very late at night, she swore she could hear whispers, not from anyone in the room, but from the baby itself. Words she did not understand, old names and places she had never heard, repeating in tones older than the house, older than the town. Mara's grandmother told her not to be afraid. But when she spoke, there was no comfort in her words, only resignation. She explained, finally, why the family had clung to rules, why certain unions had been forbidden, and why forgiveness had always seemed just out of reach. The shame wasn't just in actions, it was in the blood itself, carried quietly from one generation to the next. And now it had been released. By the third night, Mara began to see the patterns. The family portraits she had ignored as a child, the stern faces staring down from the walls, the children in faded dresses and stiff collars, began to feel alive. They were warnings echoes, the keepers of memory. And the baby, the one she had been told was forgiven, was proof that history never truly dies. It waits, it watches, and sometimes it arrives as a child whose only crime is being the truth made flesh. Days passed, but Mara felt the past closing in. The house she had grown up in, the one she thought held only childhood memories, suddenly seemed alien. Every floorboard groaned under her weight as if warning her not to step further. Every corner she turned seemed darker, heavier, thick with unspoken history. And the child never stopped watching. It was a presence that could not be ignored, a living reminder that the Aldrens' so-called forgiveness had been nothing but a fragile, temporary illusion. Neighbors began to notice changes in Mara too. Her eyes, once bright and curious, became shadowed and restless. Her voice, once warm, carried a tremor that no lullaby could soothe. Some claimed they saw her walking the property at night, holding the baby close, whispering names in the dark. Names that belonged to people long gone. People whose lives had been erased from family records and local histories alike. Mara was speaking to ghosts, or perhaps speaking for them. Inside, the family patriarch, the figure who had survived decades of secrecy and shame, finally confronted Mara. He told her the truth not in whispers or half-truths, but in a voice as cold and unwavering as stone. The Aldrens had been cursed, he said, not by God or by fate, but by their own refusal to face their history. Every attempt to bury sins, every attempt to hide the child who was too much, or wrong, had only strengthened the shadow over the family. And now, centuries later, the lineage had returned in one body, small, fragile, terrifyingly complete. The child cried, and it was no ordinary wail. It was a sound that cut through time, echoing events the living were never meant to hear. Mara's own tears fell freely, but the child's gaze remained steady, unnervingly patient. It was as though it knew something she did not. Something about the legacy she had inherited. Something about the weight of all the ancestors who had failed to forgive themselves or each other. That night, Mara finally understood the forgiveness she had been promised was never for the living. It was for the past, for the sins that had been committed, the choices that had been hidden. And yet, in some way she could not explain, the child embodied both the horror and the reckoning. To hold it was to hold a mirror, and the reflection was unbearable. The house seemed to breathe with her dread. Every shadow was alive, every whisper a warning. And Mara realized she was no longer alone, not with her ancestors, not with the ghosts, and certainly not with the child who was neither entirely innocent nor fully human in its quiet, impossible presence. Mara's days became a cycle of observation and terror. She watched the child as one might watch a storm rolling over a quiet town, an inevitability, a force beyond comprehension. The baby did not sleep like other children. Its eyes, impossibly large and unnervingly aware, followed every movement in the house, every flicker of light. Sometimes late at night, she could swear the child was listening to things she could not hear, whispers from empty rooms, footsteps in halls long abandoned, voices that spoke in languages older than any living memory. Family secrets, once hidden behind walls and whispers, now seemed to seep from the very air Mara breathed. Every portrait, every faded letter, every artifact in the house was a reminder of sins carefully concealed. She began to understand the quiet rule that had governed generations. The Aldrens were never meant to forget. They were meant to remember, and to fear what would happen if the past was denied. And now, with the child in her arms, the reckoning had arrived. Neighbors whispered too, though Mara never left the house. They spoke of strange sounds in the night, of the flickering lights and unexplained shadows. Some said they saw the child alone in the windows, staring with a gaze that felt like it could pierce through walls, through doors, through time itself. Mara's reality began to fracture. She realized she was no longer the protector of a child. She was the keeper of a truth that refused to be contained. And yet, in a strange, terrible way, the child was almost human. It laughed, or something like it, at times, a sound that could charm and chill at once. It cooed, it cried, it learned. But every small gesture carried weight, as though each movement, each glance, was a reminder of the family's centuries-old failures. Mara felt trapped in a lineage that refused closure, that insisted on repeating itself until every hidden wrong had been faced. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Could you have embraced a child that carried the legacy of so much shame? Or would you have done what the Aldrens had always feared, turn away, deny, try to bury the truth once more? Because that was the real terror Mara faced. The child was not evil. It was simply a reflection of the family's own unresolved past, alive and unblinking, waiting for them to understand the cost of every choice, every sin, every whispered secret that had been carried across generations. The days stretched into weeks, but Mara could feel the weight of history pressing harder with each passing hour. The baby's presence altered the rhythm of the house. Even the walls seemed to lean closer, listening, remembering, judging. Mara tried to distract herself, tried to treat the child as any mother would, but the truth would not be ignored. Every small action of the child, the tilt of its head, the intensity of its stare, the way it seemed to understand things no infant should, felt like a thread connecting her directly to centuries of shame. Mara began to uncover old family records she had been forbidden to see. Diaries, letters, and sketches, all meticulously hidden in trunks and behind false walls. They spoke of choices made in desperation, of love that turned into obsession, of children hidden from the world and then erased from memory. And in every line, in every faded word, Mara could feel the echo of the child in her arms, a living testament to the sins, fears, and failures that had shaped the family. It was then that Mara understood the cruel irony. The child, the forgiven one, was not a chance at redemption. It was a mirror. It reflected every failure, every transgression, every secret that had been denied for centuries. It demanded acknowledgement, demanded attention, demanded that the family face the truth they had tried so hard to bury. And if they refused, if they faltered, ignored it, or pretended the past had no hold, the child would become a warning not just for Mara, but for the generations to come. The nights grew colder, shadows deepened. Mara would sit awake, the child in her arms, feeling as though she were suspended between two worlds, one of the living, who could pretend ignorance, and one of the past, which would not be denied. The child's cry, the hollow, echoing sound she had first heard in the hospital, returned in the night, a reminder that the past was alive. It was waiting, patient, unrelenting, and now unmistakably present in the room with her. By the time Mara's grandmother returned to speak again, the weight of centuries was palpable in the air. She did not scold. She did not cry. She only said one thing, that the child was the culmination of the family's unspoken history, that what had been hidden could not remain hidden any longer, and that Mara had no choice but to look upon it, to see what they had tried to forget, and to carry the knowledge forward, or let the family legacy die in shame, once and for all. Mara held the child close, finally seeing the full weight of what it meant to be part of this family. Not just the lineage, not just the faces in the portraits, but the sins, the secrets, the whispered bargains, and the shame carried across centuries. The child was more than a newborn. It was history made flesh, an unflinching reflection of a family's refusal to forgive itself, now impossible to ignore. Every blink, every cry, every silence spoke volumes that no words could capture. She realized that forgiveness had never been about the past. It was about acknowledgement, about courage. The Aldrens had spent generations pretending, hiding, denying, hoping that what was shameful could somehow dissolve into oblivion. But some truths do not vanish. Some histories are not meant to be erased. They wait, and they return in forms that demand recognition, demanding that the living finally understand the cost of what they inherited. Mara looked into the child's eyes and saw something terrifyingly clear. The legacy would not end here. It would continue, not because of malice, not because of some curse, but because truth cannot be silenced. She felt it in the weight of the room, in the pulse of the house, in the stillness of the night. The child's presence was a reckoning, a reminder that every family secret, every act of denial, every whispered fear had consequences that could not be avoided. And yet, amid the horror, there was a fragile clarity. The child was a chance to confront the past honestly, to name the sins that had been left unspoken, to face the darkness rather than hide from it. It was a burden no one would envy, but it was also a mirror through which the family could finally see themselves in all their complexity and all their terror. Mara realized that her role, terrifying as it was to witness, to endure, and to carry this knowledge forward. Outside, the wind moved through the trees of the Aldren property, shaking loose leaves that had lain untouched for decades. The echoes of the past whispered in the rustling branches, but they no longer screamed. Inside, Mara held the child, listening to its breaths, counting its heartbeats as if each one were a step along the long path toward truth. The child was the living memory of all that had been hidden, all that had been feared, and all that had been denied. And as the first light of dawn touched the edges of the room, Mara understood a final, terrible truth. Some children are not born to forget. Some are born to remember. And some families, no matter how much they wish to bury the past, can never outrun the reflection staring back at them from the eyes of their own blood.